All right, we're rolling. So, Jeremy, glad to have you back on the show. We had some great conversations about religion. We've had some pretty intense conversations about politics behind the scenes over the years. Let me just start with this question. Do you think Kamala Harris is going to take all our meat away?
One can only hope, but no,
Did you
I
see
don't
that
see
clip I
that
sent
happening.
you?
That's yet another failed promise from a politician, I fear.
For the record, she didn't promise to take the meat away. What she promised to do was change the dietary guidelines issued by the federal government to reduce the amount of red meat that was suggested, which frankly, even just from a public health perspective, I know you have a master's in public health, but
Yeah.
I've obviously been kind of shocked by the amount of evidence that's come out showing that red meat and processed meats are really, really bad for you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And those dietary guidelines are heavily influenced right now by industry already. So
Yeah.
anyone that thinks that Kamala is going to come in there and insert politics into the dietary guidelines, whereas before there was nothing but a cool evaluation of the science and the nutritional research is wrong. I
Hmm.
mean, those are totally a byproduct of lobbying from the dairy industry, the meat industry, really the whole agriculture industry. So, I just view that as trying to inject a little bit more common sense into our nutrition guidelines because those things have huge ramifications too. Those dietary guidelines are used as the model for school lunch programs, for
Hmm.
example, all around the country. So they do have huge policy ramifications, and I think that we need to put the non-animal foods a little more front and center on that.
Yeah, that's for sure true. Well, I want to have this conversation just broadly to think about the Democratic National Convention and the presidential election from an animal rights perspective. And it's surprising how big of an issue, not just this year, but frankly in 2022, that meat consumption has had in the campaign. And people have been attacking Kamala, and the Democrats are trying to take people's meat away. I'm honestly a little stunned by that because I actually think the Democrats have been in many ways terrible on animal agriculture. I mean, most notoriously, Joe Biden stepping in on behalf of the national pork providers or National Pork Council to defend
Hmm.
kind of their position that Prop 12 needed to be struck down. So this is a law that was passed in California in 2018 to ban the use of gestation crates. And the Biden administration intervened in the case when they didn't have to. They didn't have to say anything at all. They didn't have to take a stand for or against, but they went out of their way, used a lot of government resources to try and strike down this law that California passed. And yet somehow the Democrats still feel like they're on the defensive when it comes to meat consumption. And I don't know if you have any thoughts as to why this has been such a live issue and why you see all these Trump supporters tweeting about Kamala and how she's trying to take our red meat away. But I mean, what's your sense?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple things happening. First is I agree that generally Democrats haven't been great on animal agriculture, animal rights issues in general. Um, Whether they're better or worse than Republicans, though, is another question. I
Hmm.
mean, I don't think that the Trump administration would have really done anything differently in that same case if the timing would have worked out. If we were currently living under a second Trump term, if he'd won that 2020 election, I think that they would have sided with the pork industry too.
Hmm.
So I don't know that there's much of a distinction you can draw there. I think though, in why it keeps coming up as an issue, I think that lots of times people map not just the candidates but their supporters onto our political battlefield. And I think it is broadly generally true that like the vegans, the animal protection people tend to be the urban dwellers,
Hmm.
perhaps the wokey types. And so
Did you just call
you
us the
get
wokey types?
the wokey types. You know what I'm saying? I mean, and then also there's no question too that agriculture is an industry that dominates our rural communities,
Hmm.
and rural communities tend to be very red. So it just gets mapped onto that broader, I don't know what you'd want to call that cultural civil war that's going on. I
Yeah.
think that kind of explains a lot of why um, that ends up happening.
Yeah. The
It's not so
politics of
much
the
policy.
situation.
I guess that's what I'm saying. It's not so much policy.
So here's the weird thing, though. The politics of the situation have gotten extremely odd because while it's true that agriculture is a rural industry, a lot of agricultural companies are massive companies that are kind of international and global corporations, multinational corporations like Smithfield. Um,
Hmm.
and so, for example, Trump's proposal to impose a 10% tariff on,
I think it's 20% now, by the way. I read that he recently raised it.
yeah, but that would do huge damage to companies like Smithfield or JBS. And a lot of these
Yeah.
agricultural counties actually at least the corporations that own the counties won't benefit from them. And I think by most economic analyses, the consumers and individuals living in the counties won't either, because they'll just drive up the cost of
Yeah.
everyone without
Well,
creating
not just the
benefits for
tariffs.
economic growth.
I think that the immigration policy too would
Yeah,
massively. I mean, if we were doing a mass deportation policy like Trump has proposed,
yeah.
that's going to target a lot of the laborers that these companies need.
All right. Well, so here's my general hot take that is extremely controversial, that might piss you off, and it's probably going to piss a lot of other people off too. And it's this: that there's this weird disconnect between policy and culture in the statements made by the campaigns. And that culturally, I think the Democrats are seen as the anti-meat, pro-climate, pro-animal party. And culturally, the Republicans are certainly seen as the pro-meat, pro-agriculture party. But then when you actually look at policy, I honestly, like, a lot of Trump's policies are actually kind of anti-meat. So like a tariff
Hmm.
that slows down kind of the ability of international corporations like Smithfield and JBS to ship products in and ship products out will significantly reduce the profitability of meat, and more generally, big ag and big meat. Or cutting out subsidies. I told you about this too. The efforts to kind of shut down the commodity indemnification programs and the crop insurance programs at the federal level will also hurt meat immensely. So culturally, Trump is saying a lot of things that are very pro meat, but then his policies are kind of anti meat in a lot of ways. But then when you look at Harris, she's saying all these really anti meat things. And I sent you that clip, which is a great clip, where she says, yeah, we should be eating less red meat. We should change the federal dietary guidelines so people eat less meat. But I don't know if you saw the most recent announcement the campaign made about how they're going to adjust, kind of fight the cost of living, is a massive investment in more meat production. Like they're going
Which
to basically,
who announced this?
Harris did just a couple days
Okay.
ago. She said,
Okay.
we need to invest in the American heartland. And it's a pretty classic Democratic policy in a lot of ways, because Democrats like government investment in things. But investing in particular in the meat industry and in more, she says it's small to mid-size slaughterhouses and farms. But you and I know that like a small to mid-sized farm is like an egg farm with 200,000 chickens is considered small now. It's still a factory farm.
Right.
A
Right.
slaughterhouse that's slaughtering, instead of the 20 million that Smithfield slaughters at Tar Heel, they're slaughtering like a million, which is still a massive number, and a huge
Yeah.
environmentally destructive, public health endangering facility is going to get funding from the US government. So we're in this weird place for me when I look at the policies. Like if I just took out the party from the policy, right? I'd look at a lot of the Republican policies and say like, yeah, this is like very anti-meat. I'm glad the Democrats are doing this. And then if you did like a blind taste test of policy for me, I'd look at a lot of Republican policies and think
Huh.
the Democrats are doing it. I'd look at a lot of Democratic policies and think the Republicans would be doing it. It's left me in this weird discombobulated state. So I don't know.
Hmm. Well, I would say that this election is a little bit unique in that both candidates are, in a way, incumbents,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with basically saying Kamala Harris owns the 4 years of the Biden and Harris administration. That's actually one of the reasons I like her as a candidate, because I actually think the last
Mm-hmm.
4 years haven't been that bad. And then we've already seen a Trump term. So I guess my question for you would be, we've already lived through 4 years of what a Trump administration is going to look like, and half of that time he had control of Congress as well. Did you see the meat industry decimated during those 4 years?
Oh,
Did you
definitely not.
see, and so I think that you can look at these. I think that policy statements and positions when you're on a campaign trail, you know, you always take them with a grain of salt.
But what I did see is the grassroots environmental and animal rights movement is ascending to heights they'd never ascended to under the Trump
Yeah.
administration. And partly that was
Well,
because of the effective foil effect. When you have a villain who's a good villain, it actually mobilizes people against the system. And Trump is like kind of a wrecking ball that smashes everything. But when he smashes everything, good and bad, it does reveal some of the fault lines in the entire system. So whether it's the Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, direct action everywhere. Like we hit heights that we had never hit in 2017 and 2018 when Trump was in office. And part of it was because
yeah,
people realized the system was broken. So, and
yeah,
and you look at climate change, which is a fairly mainstream issue, and I think legitimately an existential crisis, arguably the most important from a human perspective moral crisis of our time. Kamala Harris barely even mentioned it. I don't think there's a single demonstration or protest at either convention about climate change. Something has happened in the zeitgeist as a result of 4 years of Biden that's just deflated all the energy behind grassroots movements. And that's very concerning for those of us who think we need transformative and systemic change.
Well, I think part of that is because some of the goals and objectives and global outlooks or views of that movement are reflected in the administration. And so they're, at least among some people, they feel like there's not as much of a need to be agitating for something when even some of those people who lead these movements end up getting jobs in the administration. So that doesn't really surprise me. It's kind of like saying, why did the pro-life movement suddenly have smaller rallies when Trump was president? It's because they were getting what they wanted, right? I mean, that took the wind out of the sails of the pro-life movement.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not convinced the reason there's been less mobilization is because we've been getting what we want. So, for example,
But I mean,
meat
the
processors and
mobilization.
factory
Yeah,
farms had record profits under Joe Biden, like higher
sure.
profits and record subsidies. There
Yeah.
were more direct payments, or it might have been not have been more, but approximately the same in terms of subsidies to meat production companies under Biden. Same is true of oil companies. I just confirmed this and just Googled it to make sure this is true. But CNN had a headline just from a couple of weeks ago that oil companies are raking in record profits under Joe Biden. Climate change is
Hmm.
still on a very, very bad trajectory. In fact, we've reversed some of the policies that Biden had enacted early in the administration, and you've had Kamala Harris reversing herself on fracking. Right? It's not as if it's a bizarre thing, and I see the argument for it.
And
And
what was Trump's position on fracking?
I mean, Trump's position, not just on fracking, on everything related to fossil fuels, is drill, baby, drill. Right? He wants to frack as much as possible.
Sure.
He loves frack. But the point
So
is,
I guess my point is
I
that these
think
mobilizations.
there's this weird kind of malaise that develops in the left when a quote unquote liberal president is in place. It's like we expect Biden or Harris to be our savior, and we don't realize, actually change starts with us, not with Joe Biden. And Biden especially. I mean, I think Harris is a better candidate than Trump, or not just than Trump. I think she's a much better candidate than Biden. Biden has been a corporate president who's been beholden to big ag and large corporations for his entire career. He's never shown much courage, in my view. I'm not a big fan of him as a president. But if people think that Biden is the key to saving the world, to fighting kind of climate change and the abuse of animals and factory farms, it's just a false promise. And what Biden did with Prop 12 is just one damning illustration of that more general proposition that you can't rely on these Democratic
I
presidents
don't.
and elected officials to create change.
Yeah, I don't think people are depending on Biden as a savior. I don't think very many people, even especially on the left, do have that kind of savior mindset with their elected officials. I just think that it's. I mean, I think you even see that in the fact that like a majority of Democrats were supportive, if not elated, when he withdrew. No
Mm.
one was grieving him as though Kim Jong Un stepped aside. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's. I think that actually Democrats have a healthier relationship with their elected officials. They don't have some kind of parasocial relationship with them. They think that they're a means to an end to specific policy goals. And I think when it comes to even environmentalism, tax policy, foreign policy, I'm more on board with
Yeah.
what we get
Okay.
when the
Let me
Democrats
correct
in there
myself.
than
I
when
think
the
you're
Republicans in
right,
there.
and calling him a savior isn't the right word. It's more just there's a complacency that develops when there's a Democratic president in place. There's a sense in which there isn't as much urgency to create change, and basically kind of similar to what you said, that we're kind of getting what we wanted, and most people don't dive into the details. So, for example, they don't know that direct payments to factory farms were as high under Biden as they were under Trump. They don't know that. I mean, a lot of people don't even know that Donald Trump was advocating on behalf of the National Pork Production Board to strike down laws that the state of California passed. I mean, just the average consumer, the average voter has no idea these things are happening. And because they think like,
Yeah.
there's a binary choice between Trump and Biden. We got Biden. Biden is a good choice. And therefore I don't have to worry about things. You think about like all the climate marches you saw under Trump. I mean, we were seeing hundreds of thousands of people marching on the streets demanding transformative change in the economy to sustain life on this earth, to fight factory farms and increasing awareness of factory farms, right? It was mocked on the right, but there was part of the Green New Deal. There was a plan to reduce the amount of cow farts, right? It's not actually farts, it's actually their burps. And it was mocked on the right, but it was actually starting real conversations about the impact that factory farming and some of these big industries are happening having on the future of life on this earth. And now all those conversations shut down to almost nothing. When you look at the
But I guess
Sunrise Movement's Twitter page, it's like all about civil rights stuff. It's like about democracy and racism. It's like, wait a minute, aren't you a climate group? What happened to all the conversations about climate? And I think they're just scared to talk about it because they know Biden's record is just not that good.
That's a separate critique that I'd probably agree with. That there's been mission creep or loss of mission in a lot of progressive organizations. I think that's true. That should be analyzed. I don't know how much that is because of our presidential politics, though. I think there's just something kind of culturally going on with a lot of progressive left spaces where people are shifting their focus too much. But I think it's not surprising that you had giant marches during the Trump administration about climate that you didn't have under Biden, because under the Trump administration, we were constantly waking up to headlines like withdrawing from the Paris Accords and, reauthorizing the Keystone Pipeline. These were flashpoints in the discussion on climate change that Trump was greenlighting all of the, every single thing that was on the wish list of the fossil fuel corporations. And I do think that Biden has put up more barriers. He's protected a huge chunk of the Alaskan ANWR. I forget exactly what the acronym stands for. It basically set a huge chunk of Alaska off limits for drilling that Trump didn't. He's restored national monuments that Trump revoked. So I think it's not entirely true to just say the only difference between these two administrations is that one had an outrage against something that was constant in both. I don't think it's been constant in both. I think that there's a justifiable reaction and a backlash to something that's happening under Trump that isn't really happening as much under Biden.
Yeah. I'm looking at oil production in the United States, and in 2023, the U.S. produced an average of 12.9 million barrels per day, which is more crude oil than any nation in the world at any time in history and more than we've ever produced, including more than any year under the Trump administration. So you can look at to me, I look at these high level numbers, and that's what matters most, right? You can look at, the
I'm not sure if that high level matter.
Refuge, you can look at kind of national monuments and that sort of thing. I mean, the ultimate thing that matters most from climate change perspective is just greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm actually not even sure. I think they might have actually gone down or been steady because there are a lot of other changes. So for example, just the long-term shift from coal to natural gas has made a big difference in greenhouse gas emissions.
And then related to what you just said, I mean, domestic fossil fuel energy production has gone up. That's certainly true. But a big piece of that is because we've stopped importing natural gas from Russia.
From Russia. Yeah, it's true.
And so, and when we're talking about climate change, this is a global phenomenon. So just because the production has gone up in the U.S., I don't necessarily know that means we're not meeting goals and targets. We probably aren't, because I do think overall we're failing we're failing to solve climate change overall. I'd agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I could see the argument that it's okay for us to increase our domestic production because we're shifting away from Saudi Arabia. But if the goal is to get to kind of net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and the goal is to transition to a green energy economy, putting more investments and promoting more fossil fuel production in the United States seems like the opposite of what we should be doing. And I can only imagine, like, if you can imagine if Trump were doing that, if we saw massive increases in profits and production under the Trump administration, every liberal group in the country would be saying, oh my God, this is a disaster. Can you believe that despite this climate crisis, it's impending, all the wildfires and, and hurricanes and all the, heat waves that are crossing the entire globe, that Trump is allowing record production and record profits for oil companies. I mean, every environmentalist in the nation would be, getting on their megaphone and hitting the streets, but that literally happened under Biden. And I just have seen almost no media about it at all. Like, it's just, no one discusses it. Even Sunrise, even the groups that are focused on fossil fuels, they don't tweet about, hey, I mean, and again, I think maybe there's an argument you can rationalize and explain it, but then it should be explained and rationalized. And we should make sure, hey, this is not like a permanent change. It's not something, and there are concerns, even if you think the net impact on fossil fuel emissions is a good thing for us to increase production because it takes production away from Saudi Arabia. That changes our politics in weird ways. Because if we're investing more in fossil fuel production in the United States, if there are more jobs related to fossil fuel production, I'm on the board of the Climate Defense Project, and I can say it is extremely hard to dislodge an entrenched industry once there are a lot of American jobs and a lot of American money involved. Well, it's very easy to attack China and Saudi Arabia. It's like, everybody likes doing that, like it's great. Like, let's shut down all the
Sure.
Chinese fossil fuel companies, but American fossil fuel companies, ooh, you're in some trouble there, right? I mean, even when these fossil fuel companies are literally killing their own people, like in West Virginia coal mining. I mean, these coal mines, the people who are hurt most by West Virginia coal mining are West Virginians. And yet we can't dislodge the industry because it's an American industry. There are a lot of jobs at stake. And to see like record increases in oil production in the United States to the point that we're producing more oil than we've ever produced in American
Yeah.
history.
So my
Why are
question
people
for
not
you then,
talking
Wayne,
about this?
is if your concern
Mm-hmm.
is an entrenchment of domestic fossil fuel suppliers, then why in the world would you give an ounce of credence to Trump's proposed 20% tariffs?
Yeah,
Because that's what
that's
tariffs
true.
would encourage.
Yeah, no, you're right.
So,
That's a good point.
I think that, there's a lot of, what's the word, unintended consequences of
Mm-hmm.
policies that are happening. And, and I know you keep bringing up and shoving in my face that fossil fuel companies have had record profits under Biden. Before Biden, they had record profits under Trump. And before Trump, they had record profits under Obama. And a lot of this is just the byproduct that, frankly, the American economy overall has been on a trajectory of growth for quite a little while now, at least since the recession, other than a weird blip during the pandemic. But so it doesn't really mean very much to me in terms of what it says about Trump's policies or what it says about Biden's policies.
Yeah, I'm not sure we actually saw record oil production and profits under Trump. Um,
Record for that
he,
time.
yeah, so it might have been. I'm actually not 100% sure about that. Yeah, I mean, I think all this policy analysis is difficult for sure. And you're right about tariffs, that tariffs can create a more entrenched domestic industry. They can also damage industry domestically because a lot of the things that domestic oil companies need in terms of the supply chain come from international sources, right? So they cannot buy computer chips from China or rare earth minerals from Africa or whatever it is. So, I mean, in general, it's this weird thing where, I mean, tariffs are just a form of taxation. And I was just listening to a New York Times podcast about how Trump is actually proposing one of the largest tax increases in American history, right? Like this 20%
Mm-hmm,
tariff
mm-hmm.
thing is actually a huge increase in taxes. And that's generally a policy. I mean, granted, typically not tariffs, but taxation increases are something that Democrats support, right? We want
Right.
more revenue for the government to do random things. And we want to, and so like increases in taxes as a general matter, hurt corporations. They basically shift the allocation of GDP away from private production to public production. Like the government and the taxpayers get more money in general to do whatever we want to do. And so part of it is just for me, higher taxes. The tariff is certainly not the best form of taxation. I mean, I think it's very regressive because it tends to be, it tends to target a lot of things that ordinary people need to buy. It's not like a tax on corporate profit, for example, which would be a lot better, like on
Mm-hmm.
private equity. But
It's regressive.
it's regressive. Yeah, it hits like people who are poor more. So it's certainly not the best tax. But we are in this weird situation where a lot of the Republican orthodoxies that used to be the case are being abandoned by Trump, and a lot of the
Oh yeah.
liberal orthodoxies that used to be endorsed, like I mean, deregulation is another example. Like one of, granted, this is mostly on housing, but one of the big issues that a number of Democrats were discussing during the convention was we need to deregulate land use.
I know.
And
I
that's
saw that.
primarily
I
for
don't know if I.
housing.
I don't know if I agree with that. By the way, I know that
Yeah,
that's become the
yeah, it's
left
become
wing
like a
orthodoxy.
liberal coastal elite orthodoxy that we need to deregulate land use. And I'm not convinced that's true either, because that actually benefits a lot of big companies, including farms. Like they don't want any restrictions on what they can do and what they cannot do. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I just think it's left us in a pretty weird world. Let me ask you this.
I,
What do you
I, I
think?
think yeah. I was just going to say, just to add an addendum to what you just said. Like I think there's no question that the Paul Ryan version of conservatism is
Is
dead
dead.
as hell.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe if Trump loses this election really badly, they'll kind of return to that. Maybe,
Hmm.
but as long as Trump is defining the party, which he clearly is, he's abandoned that quite a while ago. So I think that's gone.
Yeah. And this comes out in weird ways. So in Utah, for example, I mean, I think you were one of the people who recommended we use this framing. Kind of Smithfield is a big corporation that tortures and kills a lot of pigs, and it's an agricultural corporation. It's also a Chinese corporation.
Yeah.
And a lot
They
of,
don't like to talk about that,
I
but
know
yeah.
they don't like to talk about that. And on all their advertising, like
Yeah.
there's that, I think you were the one who pointed this out. They had this ad with American flags everywhere, and they didn't realize that one of the things they had done is they had these kids sitting on an American flag, like laying down
Oh,
on it.
that was Steve Maxfield that pointed that out.
Oh yeah, Steve
That
pointed it
was
out, but you shared it with me. And
yeah,
so you
yeah.
had all these Republicans who were super mad at Smithfield for like having these children lying on the American flag in this really disrespectful way. But I can see the Republican Party partly because of this weird nativist sentiment. And I'm not saying this is the right alliance for us to form, but it just points out the weird situation we're in. Being against some of the big factory farming corporations just because they're global and they hate the global elites and they hate these global multinational corporations like Smithfield, like JBS, and they don't want them messing with our country and our jobs. And so there's an argument that, like with Smithfield, for example, the fact they're polluting the air and the water, they're causing all these public health threats, they're producing all these tortured animals and then shipping a huge amount of the product to other countries like China, right? That the Republican Party will become, in many ways, like a better ally to our efforts than
Yeah.
coastal elites who want cheap food. They want deregulation. They like these global companies for various reasons that the Republican parties do not buy into. But
I think that the cold hard reality of jobs though is going to interfere with what you just suggested might happen.
yeah,
It's just Smithfield. I mean, as you know, has essentially left Beaver now.
hmm
I don't know if it's there at all anymore. Do you know? I know that they kept increasing at first they said we're just getting rid of half the jobs, and then it was like
hmm
they were trying to let people down gently, but I think they might have just completely exited
hmm
from Beaver finally. And whatever those people who lived there may have thought or suppressed about what they thought about them being a foreign corporation, they still provided jobs.
yeah,
And a lot of rural America does have a crisis with job opportunities, and ag is one of the only things that kind of steps up and fills that vacuum. Even if they're less than perfect corporations, they create company towns where everyone supports the company because the company is the only thing keeping the town alive.
yeah,
And they'll look the other way about a lot of problems. They'll look the other way about workplace safety violations, environmental problems,
hmm
because it's the only thing that's even making it so they can survive there.
yeah.
And
I
that's a
mean,
challenge.
this is one area where I wish we could get the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in alignment on just the danger of concentrations of corporate power, whether domestic or
Hmm.
international. Whether it's Smithfield or Google,
Yeah,
and it's
yeah,
there's a recent federal court case that led to a finding that Google is a monopoly. I don't think it's
I saw
gotten
that.
to
Yeah.
the kind of the penalty phase of the trial, but and people on the right and the left cheered that on, and I almost think that if we could shift our focus away from some of the culture war issues, which I mean, I'm not saying they're not important for a lot of people. So gay rights, obviously, even the meat reduction stuff, a lot of the fights feel very culture war-y. It's not actually about,
Hmm.
okay, let's have like
Oh
a
yeah,
sober discussion about the impacts of
yeah.
meat on the planet. It's just like, you're taking our meat away. I
Well,
want my bacon.
look, Exhibit A of that is DeSantis banning lab grown
Yeah,
meat, which is a
cultivated meat.
product that
That's
doesn't
completely
exist.
stupid.
This is a product that doesn't even exist. And
Yeah.
so we're legislating to prohibit fantasies now.
Yeah. But if we could just shift away from that and just ask, all right, do we like JBS? Do we like Smithfield? Do we like Tyson? These companies that have decimated the landscape of America, physically, just geographically. I mean, all the wild animals and forests are being destroyed by these huge factory farms. Economically, they have an economic stranglehold on places like Beaver County. And I just Googled it, and yeah, Beaver County is cutting jobs, or Smithfield is cutting jobs in Beaver again. And there's an article in the Deseret News about how the end of hog farming is going to kill rural Utah, right? There has to be some understanding by both the right and the left that the concentration of power in the hands of a small number of corporations is dangerous for all of us. It's not a
Right.
genuine democracy anymore when one CEO can just say, like, you know what, I'm going to decide that a third of the people in this county are not going to have jobs anymore, and there's no one who can stop me just because I want to make more money. not because it's in the community
Yeah.
interest or the planet's interest, just because I want to make a little more money. So I'm going to shut everything down. It's scary.
Yep. It is.
What do you think is, all right, so let me ask you this. What do you think is the most promising thing? What is the thing that makes you excited? If you were to go to an animal advocate and say, this is why you should support the Harris/Biden ticket, or I guess it's Harris-Walz ticket now, but what do you think is the thing that you say to them that is most persuasive?
I'm making specifically a pitch on animal rights grounds.
Yeah, for animal
Specifically
rights
that.
purposes. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if there is a strong pitch on those grounds. I don't. I don't think that.
Oh no. I had
because
you on here to be my
yeah,
foil, Jeremy. You were supposed to be the person
yeah.
going to bat for Harris.
I would probably, quickly change the conversation to other issues that I think are really important. But,
Yeah.
I don't, it's I think that the bottom line is that we are I mean, animal rights advocates
Mm-hmm.
are a tiny, tiny minority. And we're not especially concentrated in swing states.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just doesn't surprise me that presidential electoral campaigns are not going to have a lot for us.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a reason there's so much conversation about fracking, and it's that's a major industry in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is a swing state. Okay. If Pennsylvania was undergoing some kind of culture war where half the country was vegan and half the country ate meat, I might expect to see this issue bubble up into that conversation, but it just doesn't. And I just think that that's just kind of inevitable because of the size of this constituency, where it's located. So it's a little unreasonable, I think, to demand or expect that presidential campaigns are going to have anything substantive on this issue that, frankly, a small number of people in the wrong states care about.
Yeah, I mean, is it really true that people don't care about these issues, or is it just a matter of the attention that is being provided to these issues by the media and the culture? I mean, my sense is that people do care about things like, for example, public health. They care about their kids dying of antibiotic-resistant diseases. They care about pandemics. They care about, we were just talking about how processed meats and red meats are, increasingly seen by all of the most reputable scientists in the world as serious public health threats, right? Like
Yeah.
a class 1 carcinogen by the WHO, and everything from not just cancer to heart disease to diabetes. I mean, saturated fat from meat is incredibly deadly. People do care about these issues, it seems to me. It's just there isn't enough leadership and attention on the issues to force our elected officials and our policy in a way that most people actually want it to move.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a two-way street between, when you ask, is it that people don't care about these, or is it just not being reflected in media and culture? Right. I think that goes both directions. It's not being reflected in media and culture because it's not something that it's on people's minds, and it's not on people's minds because it's not being talked about in media and culture.
Yeah.
In terms of, those issues you just brought up, like public health and antibiotic resistance. I mean, first of all, those are somewhat ancillary to when we're talking about animal rights. I mean, there's some overlap between those issues. But secondly, I actually don't know that those are big issues on voters' minds this election. It seems to me it's all about like immigration, inflation, the economy. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's do you think that that's certainly what the media is talking about? And you think that the media is overlooking a large sort of organic concern that exists in the population that's not being reflected in the media?
I think there's a chicken and the egg problem. I think a lot of times animal advocates and advocates of other sorts say like, oh, we can't talk about this issue because no one cares about it. So we don't talk about it. But because we don't talk about it, nobody cares about it. Right?
That's true.
It's like
Yeah.
climate change. I mean, for years, everyone was saying like, oh, I guess the public just doesn't care about climate change. And then Standing Rock happened and Sunrise happened and people disrupted Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein. And then you get, a bunch of House members like at the time, less so now, but AOC coming in there with a Green New Deal, and suddenly everyone cares about it. And we say like, oh yeah, everyone cares about this. I mean, my sense of public concern, and this is honestly a little scary, is that the public is kind of flipping from one issue to the next somewhat arbitrarily. Like Gaza was such a big deal 6 months ago, and now it feels like no one even remembers what the hell Gaza is.
This
it's
is like Walter Lippmann called this the bewildered herd.
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Or
like the
Black Lives
media
Matter.
is just, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, in
yeah.
2020, you have George Floyd happen, and like literally everyone could just talk about racism, and then no one cares about it. Like there was another incident of a police shooting in New York, not in Arkansas or Georgia. It was like in New York City, and it was just another mental health issue where cops came to someone's house and just shot them, and it's gotten barely any media attention at all. It's just
Although I see,
so.
though, I think that this is a good example, though, of what I was saying earlier. When I think some of this is because the problem is not as severe as it was. Okay, and I'll give you an example. I don't know about the New York one, I admit that, but did you see the one that kind of went viral? I forget right now where it was, but there was a black woman in her home in her
Yeah.
kitchen,
Hot water.
and this hot water. Okay, I
Yeah.
think a lot of people saw that, and I forget her name right now. I think maybe Massey was the last
Mhm.
name, and immediately that officer was prosecuted, and other officers, basically cooperated with the prosecution, put out statements. That didn't used to happen. It didn't used to happen that that used to be so rare. And so I do think there's been some actual change in the culture and in policy with policing. And so we can't ignore the fact that there's been some progress made. And that might be why, in at least in small part, the outrage is dampened.
Um, all right, I just looked this up because again, I always like looking at the
Yeah,
data.
sure.
Um, in the last, let's see how many years this is. I'm looking at the data. In the last 10 years, what year had the highest number of fatal police shootings from 2015 to 2023? Let's say the last 8 years.
I have no idea.
It's 2023.
I mean, I think that one statistic kind of doesn't tell the whole story.
Guess what the next highest number was? 2022.
2022. So this tells
The
me
next highest
already that
number,
this could. So this already
2021.
tells me. So this already tells me that this statistic could be an artifact of just we're getting better at collecting data. If it's just stepwise
Possible.
increases year after year,
Okay, but it's
because
possible,
I
but
do
it's
know
not.
that. Yeah. I guess we'll just. I'd have to do a deeper dive.
Yeah.
Then, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, like, so for example, things went down from 2015 had a higher number than 2016, 17, and 18. It's gone up now under Biden when it didn't go up under Trump, right? And I think that's partly because under Trump, part of the reason I think George Floyd happened was because of Trump. Like, I mean, George Floyd happened because Derek Chauvin murdered him, obviously. But part of the reason everyone knows George Floyd's name and there was a mass movement against racism and policing and police shootings was because of Trump. Because people realized, look, our
Well,
government's
I
not
think
doing their
actually
job.
the pandemic also was a pretty
The
strong.
pandemic
I
too,
think
for
the
sure.
pandemic was a
But I
strong
think,
factor.
but
Yeah.
if people, like Biden pays lip service, and even like Kamala Harris, like in 2019, everyone was like, "Oh my God, Kamala's a cop," and we looked, and I sent you some stuff about this. We did a deep dive as a nation into some of the policies that Harris enacted, and frankly, some of the stuff that went viral on social media is not even the worst stuff that she did. I mean, so for example, she prosecuted a bunch of marijuana offenders. She tried to put parents in jail for their kids being truant. But there are many cases. There was one case that I think I sent you, and I think you didn't read through all the details, which is fine because it's a long case, where literally a prosecutor fabricated a transcript. He injected a false confession into his transcript. So basically what happened is you had a criminal defendant who had spoken to the police, which you should never do for the record. So I don't know why this defendant was speaking to the police in the first place, but it was a Spanish language audio file. And so they basically had to translate into English for his public defender. And the prosecutor fabricated a line that was a confession where the police officer says something along the lines of, you're a child abuser, aren't you? And the guy says, yeah. But at least, I didn't kill them or something like that. So complete fabrication. And Kamala Harris defended that conviction and fought tooth and nail to prevent the Court of Appeals and the trial court from dismissing the case. And and there was some scrutiny on these things in 2019 and 2020 because Trump was in office and there was an understanding, hey, there's systemic problems and Democrats need to get the ship in order. You cannot be like Trump. And now with Biden in power, I feel like with situations like police shootings, I mean, I'm just looking at the database. And again, maybe there is an explanation. And by the way, when I look at 2024, it looks like 2024 on I'm looking at a chart in the Washington Post, is on a trajectory to have the highest numbers of police shootings in American history. So it's going to be higher than 2023. It's possible there's some rationalization, some explanation, just like there's an explanation for why oil production is at record highs. There's an explanation for why factory farming is hitting record profits. But when you see so many different metrics and you say like the progressive analysis on this should be that this is a bad outcome, and in every single metric, you have to rationalize and explain why it's not as bad as it looks. At some point, you have to ask yourself, are we on the right path? I mean, is the Democratic Party actually doing anything that is fulfilling the
Yeah.
promises it's making to the public? Not just on animal rights, but on police shootings, on oil production, on antitrust and
Yeah.
factory farming, and all these issues.
I'll just put it this way in terms of police abuses and abuses of people's civil rights. I've worked pretty closely with a civil rights attorney recently, and I've known many civil rights attorneys over many years. This is an area of practice I know a little bit about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just telling you that 9 times out of 10, if we have a client who is the victim of excessive force by police, when we draw a judge who's a Biden appointee,
Mm-hmm.
we're relieved. When we draw a judge who's a Trump appointee, it's going to be a more uphill battle.
Yeah.
On issues of things like qualified immunity, you'd much rather have a judge with, frankly, a more liberal mindset. The conservative judges are just, frankly, more pro-cop, and they're going to find whatever procedural step they need to take. And I mean, even on some of the metrics that you were talking about with Kamala, you mentioned that she went after people for marijuana convictions. Well, our politics have changed a lot in the last few years. And I think that overall Democrats have been on the right side of that change. The Biden administration has removed marijuana from Schedule 1. Biden did the largest presidential pardon in U.S. history. You can look that up, of thousands of people for nonviolent marijuana convictions. So that's something that Trump could have done and never did.
It's all virtue
And in fact,
signaling.
it's all what?
It's all virtue signaling to me.
Say that one more time. Sorry, you cut out.
It all feels like virtue signaling to me. It's like Biden has become an embodiment of the online left, where you say and do things that are very symbolically progressive. While
I don't understand how how is letting people out of prison virtue signaling. I mean, those people who were let out of prison are certainly glad that
total number
virtue
of
signal
people
was
being
sent.
shot and killed by the police, if the total number of people being incarcerated by our government is still skyrocketing, I haven't looked at the numbers on incarceration. Let's look at them now. But the point is, virtue signaling is when you wave your hand at some social justice issue and say, like, I am the most anti-racist person in the world. And you don't actually give a damn about racism. And like, you're doing a lot of racist things, and you're using some little signal to make it seem like you're better than you are. Or like, I am the best male feminist, and you're secretly like sexually harassing and doing all sorts of horrible things behind the scenes, right? And to me, the Biden administration does a lot of that. They do a lot of like virtue signaling style stuff, while fundamentally the metrics are really bad. But let's look at the number of incarcerated people.
I know what virtue signaling is. I just don't think removing marijuana off Schedule 1 is a policy change. That's not a virtue signal. Letting people out of prison is a policy change. That's not a virtue signal. Expanding food stamps eligibility, which the Biden administration did, is a policy change. It's not a virtue signal. So I don't think I agree that everything that's happened in the last 4 years has just been virtue signaling.
So I'm not saying those aren't improvements, in the same way that if someone tweets on Twitter, Black Lives Matter, it's better they tweeted than didn't, especially when people are being killed and incarcerated because of the color of their skin. But if they're tweeting that as like a shield and a way to deflect from the fact that there are horribly racist things that they're doing or that society is doing that therefore don't get the attention they deserve. And this is kind of disturbing to me. I'm looking at the numbers of incarcerated people in the United States, which, if you care about racial justice incarceration, racial justice in policing, the number one issue to me is mass incarceration, right? We put more people in prison in this country than essentially any developed country in the world. And having been incarcerated recently, it's an awful experience. It's like terrible. We treat them the same way we treat non-human animals. They're completely disposable. They get beaten. I had a jail cell that was like flooding of feces, and the guards didn't even let people out. Just like, do you want people to just drown in their own feces? I guess this is what you want. And I'm looking at the numbers from the Sentencing Project. You're not going to be surprised by this. Guess what the trend was from 2016 to 2020 in the number of incarcerated people in this country?
Upwards.
Down significantly. And not just because of 2020. It wasn't just because everyone was released. 2016 was higher than 2017, which is higher than 2018, which is higher than 2019, which is higher than 2020. And between
Wait, when
2016
you
and
say higher,
2019,
I'm getting a little lost. What was
it's
higher?
going down every year. 2016 was the highest number,
So the
according to the
rate
Statistical
of
Project.
decrease was higher, you're saying?
No, I'm saying the total number of people incarcerated, people in prisons in the United States in 2016 was about 1.5 million. In 2017, it went down to about 1.4. In 2017, it went down, or in 2018, it went down to about, looks like 1.3. And then 2019 and 2020 was the lowest. In the last 10 years, the lowest number of people incarcerated we had in this country were in 2019 and 2020. And guess what happens in 2021 and 2022 under Biden?
You
Goes
also
back
had a
up.
massive you also had a massive spike in crime at the end of Trump's term.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, but
Maybe. I think that was pretty well documented.
I mean, it depends on the allocation of crime. I mean, like the reason I know about this is because I was
I
involved
mean, I
in.
think I'm defining it in the most
Yeah.
traditional sense of the term in things like murder.
Mm.
I think the murder rate went way higher in 2020, 2021.
Murder rate. Let's look it up. 2021, 2020.
Sure.
I actually don't know. I just know that in San Francisco, murders in the United States, murder rate over time. In San Francisco, there was a lot of kind of, in my view, propaganda about the number of murders in the United States, or in murders in San Francisco, and it actually wasn't going up very much, if at all.
So
What the
look at,
data
I
say
just know
about
in
crimes?
2020, this was, I mean, it's, a lot of people speculated this was because of the pandemic.
Yeah,
I remember reading many articles that in 2020, we saw one of the largest increases we've ever seen in the murder
yeah,
rate. I definitely remember reading that. I didn't imagine
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, the pandemic was massively disruptive to
yeah,
society. And, I think we probably should do a little bit more as a society of an autopsy on what happened there than we have. Um, because it produced all kinds of weird effects in the economy and crime,
yeah,
and immigration. It's the same thing with when Trump is always bragging about how at the end of his term, immigration was like at the lowest point it's been in 40 years. It's because global movement of people ground to a halt
yeah,
in 2020 during the pandemic. So we have to be very careful using the last, 8 years as just nothing more than raw
yeah,
data. It's always not going to tell the whole story because it's been a weird time.
yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, but again, like when every trend is like going in the wrong direction under Biden at the national level, at the high level, it starts
Did
feeling
you?
like there's
Yeah.
something weird happening. I just sent you a link with the number of mass people incarcerated in the United
I
States.
don't think yeah. I don't think I agree that every trend is going in the wrong direction. I think
That's
child
true. I mean,
poverty's gone way
that's
down.
always not going to be true. I mean,
Um,
and for example, in immigration, I'm pretty sure. Actually, I kind of want to check this now too. I just want to look at. So, if you were to look at immigration, what is the most important high level statistic to determine how things are in terms of just how inclusive we are and how welcoming we are of immigrants? It's probably deportations, maybe. Like how many people are we deporting? Is that a fair? I'd be interested to see how many
I don't know
deportations there
actually.
were under
I
Biden.
think that would be a hard one. I'd have to think about that. I'd have to think about that. I don't
But
have
I
a
think,
quick way to answer
don't you
that.
think most people would probably guess? And I don't even know what the answer to this, so we're going to look it up together. Most people probably guess there are way more people deported under Trump than Biden. Would you say that's like a fair
Um,
assumption to make, that most people's intuition would be there are more people deported under Trump than
yeah, and
Biden?
I would think that's even true. Is that not true?
I don't know. Let's look it up. I have no idea. I mean,
Okay.
I didn't know until this very moment that the number of people incarcerated had gone down under Trump and went up under Biden. And again, there might be some explanation for it, but that's a little disturbing to me because mass incarceration mass incarceration is a waste of time. It is a waste of money. It destroys people's lives. It's a
Yeah.
horrible, horrible system. And there's
I
basically
think I think
no
you
policy analyst who thinks that mass incarceration has been effective.
yeah. I agree with that. My first of all, I think that the vast majority of the activity we see in the criminal justice system in the United States happens at the state level,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
So
it's true.
how much it's a byproduct of federal
Of the federal
policy,
government. Yeah,
I'm sure it influences things and it's a factor, but a lot of this is happening at the state level in all 50 states. So there's that. And I just think that if your issue is criminal justice reform and trying to reduce or minimize the cruelty that I completely agree with you exists in our
hmm,
criminal justice system, it's horrific. It's way excessively cruel. Um, most of the people working to try to fix that are Democrats. I think
Yeah.
that most Republicans have a mentality of they broke the law, throw them in a cage and throw away the key, or better yet, fry them in an electric chair.
Yeah.
Um, I think that tends to be the attitude, and so we can work ourselves into all these knots about which party will happen to produce better stats on this or that. But in the end of the day, if we elect people that don't give a damn
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
criminals or people in prison, we're going to get policies that don't give a damn about people in prison.
Yeah. I'm trying to find the chart and I can't find it right now on deportations, but
Oh,
yeah,
that's
it's weird.
okay. And
It's
again,
kind of a,
maybe, yeah.
it's a weird way. Yeah. Cause you're right that these high level statistics are very much out of any individual president's control, and they're longer term trends that matter a lot, whether it's crime and mass incarceration or, um, like global politics and the shift in production and oil from Saudi Arabia to the United States and net oil production in the United States. So it's hard to assess how any particular metric relates to any particular elected official. But
Yeah.
I don't know.
I
I
found,
just
by
think,
the way,
yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. I was just going to say, I found a table for removals, which I think is the
Hmm.
euphemism for deportations.
And it's probably gone down, right? Under Biden.
Well, it only has through Trump, so that's not very helpful, is it?
Yeah.
It definitely went up under Trump, but I don't know if it went back down under Biden. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Interesting. I found a couple charts that seem to suggest in 2022 things have gone better. There's a number of
Oh wait,
criminal related grounds.
here. See this thing I just barely texted you. I've only read the headline, but
Huh. Did you send this to me in a text message?
oh, I just sent it in the studio chat. Sorry,
Okay.
I can
Yeah.
send it to you on
Cool.
Signal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I see it. Interesting. Oh, wow. This is terrible. You just sent me something that totally contradicted what both of us thought was true. Biden is now
I
deporting
didn't.
more people than
I didn't
Trump.
have a thought on what was true. I didn't. I didn't know. I didn't know what would be true. So
That's terrible. Okay, so it looks
it's
like okay.
interesting
I'm,
though
I'm looking.
how
I'm looking at.
how
I'm looking at
yeah.
the chart that's actually here. So it is true in 2023, Biden deported more people, but on net from 2021 through 2024, Biden has deported far fewer people than Trump. What is true, and this is very uncommonly known, is that Obama deported way more people than Trump did. So
Yeah.
total 2.9 million deportations from 2009 to 2012, 1.9 million in his second term, and then Trump was 1.5 million. And Biden so far has deported 1.1 million. Granted, he's still got, one more year to go, or
Yeah.
at least a few more months to go.
I always think, yeah, it's always, I mean, the big question I have though, hearing that even is what was the denominator of how many people
Yeah.
entered?
Yeah. How many people are?
Obviously, way fewer people were entering 2020, 2021. So it makes sense that removals would be down
Down. Yeah.
because the pandemic was going on again. And so
Yeah.
there weren't
So
as many
people aren't
people
moving at
entering the
all.
country. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
You're not doing a
So
very good
it's,
job of defending Biden.
I mean, yeah, I guess it would be defending Kamala, right?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I just think that Trump, I do think, is a threat to rule of law
Mm.
and just sort of basic principles of democracy. And I
Yeah.
think that that's ultimately kind of and he's gotten the whole Republican Party to go along with this nonsense. The 2020 election was stolen.
Hmm.
And I think that's just kind of a deal breaker for me.
Yeah. That makes sense.
I mean,
I
I
mean, for the
disagree with
record,
on a
I'm
lot of
not
the
defending
policy stuff
Trump.
too,
I mean,
but
I mostly,
yeah.
I mostly just don't think it's as big of a deal as a lot of people think if Trump is elected. And I think part of the reason is I agree with you that Trump is a threat to the rule of law and democracy. I just don't think we have the rule of law and democracy now. I just think, I mean,
Oh, it
it's
could
kind of
be
like
worse. It could be
it
so
could be.
much worse.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, but when you have the government defending prosecutors who are injecting false confessions into transcripts, when you have like cases like mine in Sonoma County where a judge can just decide, yeah, the First Amendment doesn't apply to you. You can't speak to the media, and there's nothing that can be done about it. When you have these animals routinely being brutalized in violation of state and federal animal cruelty law now, because we now have a federal law, PACT, the Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act, that is kind of shockingly broad. I mean, it has some exemptions for kind of, I mean, accepted animal husbandry practices, but you and I know, whether it's labs or factory farms, they violate their own standards all the time, and no one ever prosecutes them. I mean, I just don't think we have the rule of law now. The vast majority, 99% of the victims of criminal conduct in this country don't even get an investigation. And that's non-human animals, because
Mhm.
every chicken who's eviscerated alive or scalded alive in a slaughterhouse, that should be an animal cruelty charge. Even in Utah, I mean, in Utah, the standard is customary animal husbandry practices are exempted from an animal
Right.
cruelty charge, right? But by the industry's own stated customs and policies, you are not supposed to allow an animal to go into a scalding tank, an animal to go past, the blade that cuts their throats in a conscious state. And that happens all the time. And it happens literally
Yeah.
on the scale of, I don't actually, are there poultry
So
slaughterhouses in Utah?
there's not actually. There's
Really?
not.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
I know there are other
Yeah.
slaughterhouses. There's like cattle slaughterhouses and stuff.
There's a cattle slaughterhouse in the Logan area.
Yeah.
Um, that may be the only one now. We used to have another one that shut down, but I don't think that that's a rule of law issue, to be honest, at its core. I just think that, and it's horrible. I obviously agree it's horrible, but this may be more depressing. I just think it's reflecting a general societal lack of care
Hmm.
about that issue and about animals. And we're just seeing the government reflect broad social norms and attitudes. And so that doesn't strike me as a rule of law issue.
Hmm. But isn't the point of the rule of law that it's not based on the popular sentiments of the moment or the leanings politically of the elected officials in place, but what the law actually says? I mean, and the law says that, and I could cite
Yeah.
chapter and verse the Utah animal cruelty law, but I'm pretty sure allowing an animal to be scalded alive, and certainly if somebody did this to one dog just in their backyard for fun, everyone would say like, yeah, that's a crime. Stop that. And I don't know
Yeah.
why if it happens to a cow, it should be any different, because
But
the
what
law
you
doesn't draw a
pointed
distinction.
out, but what you pointed out was that every time a chicken has their throat cut alive, or the horrible acts of violence that do happen all the time, there should be an investigation and
Hmm.
there should be a prosecution, and that's a question of deployment of resources, and that kind of is a political question. That's not
Yeah,
necessarily a rule of law
prosecutorial
question.
discretion. Yeah.
Prosecutorial, and there's always going to be prosecutorial discretion. There's a million laws and a million crimes, and where we deploy those resources is ultimately going to be a political question. That's why you do see changes in law enforcement activity and priorities as administrations change at both the local
Yeah.
and federal level. I don't think that's because the conception of the rule of law is
Hmm.
shifting with each administration. It's just there's different political priorities, and you may have LBJ gets in there, and suddenly hate crimes are being investigated.
Hmm.
Um, that's kind of a political thing.
I mean, the reason I think it is a rule of law question is because the rule of law as a principle is that it's not the particular individuals who determine what the rules of our society are. It's some sort of systemic process that's objective. And what happens to animals is the greatest example of the distortion of the idea that there's an objective process that leads to a reason based, a fact based, a logic based conclusion as to who gets punished and who doesn't. And
Hmm.
it's also an exemplification of larger problems in our political system. It's not just animals that get screwed over. It's also, frankly, coal miners in West Virginia who get screwed over. It's homeless people in San Francisco. It's people who are incarcerated. It's anyone who's poor relative to anyone who's rich. And so, it's the most powerful demonstration of the distortion of our legal system towards power and money. Because the animals have literally no power and money, so you can literally boil an animal alive and no one cares in our system. And
Yeah.
like a lot of human beings and Americans will say like, okay, well, that's just about speciesism. That's a huge problem, of course, but it's not, as you put it, it's not a rule of law problem. But to me, it is, because it's not just that the political system can be deployed against animals in a way that's incredibly destructive. The fact that it can be deployed against animals in a way that's completely arbitrary, inconsistent, and hypocritical shows the entire system can be deployed against anyone in a way that's arbitrary and destructive and not consistent with the objective reality of what the law, quote unquote, says, right? Um, so to me, it is a rule of law issue. And even if you look at kind of, did you hear about this antitrust case involving poultry companies a couple of
I don't
years
think I
ago?
did actually. No, I
Yeah.
don't think I
So
did.
there was there was this huge price fixing scandal, including involving all of the big factory farms like Tyson, Purdue, all of them were sued because they're all basically getting together and saying like, hey, let's just screw over American consumers by all making sure our prices are really high, because if we
Sure.
compete, and it's like, um, and it actually came down. The judgment came down around the same time I was accused of conspiracy, because basically the big corporations are accused of conspiracy, and I kid you not, like there was evidence in that case where the companies just admitted they were engaged in an unlawful conspiracy to fix prices, and they still weren't convicted and punished. And partly that's not entirely Biden's fault. I think Biden actually did a better job of this than most presidential administrations have. Like Lena Khan. Lena Khan is like one of the few good choices. Lena Khan is the head of, I think, the Federal Trade Commission, and she's gone after big companies in a way that I think is actually pretty unprecedented in the last 50 years. There's presidents and big corporations have been, tied at the hip for most of the last half century, maybe even before that. Like Dwight D. Eisenhower talked about this in the context of the military-industrial complex, but big corporations have had enormous influence on politics. But you have simultaneously a case where I actually did not have a conspiracy to break any laws, and there was no evidence presented, because all the evidence presented in my conspiracy case was we believe what we were doing is lawful. We had a legal opinion. We're trying to do things the right way. We're trying to stop the law-breaking activity of this factory farm, and we don't even get to introduce that evidence, and I get thrown in jail for it. Yet these big corporations are literally admitting they're engaging in unlawful conspiracy. And for those who are non-lawyers on the call, an essential element of a conspiracy charge is what's called mens rea. There has to be criminal intent. It's not enough that you did something. Like you can get together and have a party where you have everyone smoke weed. That's not actually a conspiracy to violate the drug laws of the United States. If you didn't know smoking weed is illegal, if you thought, oh, I thought it had been legalized, I didn't realize it wasn't it's still a Schedule 1 drug or whatever schedule it is. It's under the Controlled Substances
I don't
Act.
think though that mistake of law
It depends on
goes
the
to
state.
mens rea in that way.
No, it depends on the state. In California,
Okay.
it does. It depends on the state, but in
Okay.
California, it does.
So
And
in California, you'd be like, I thought murder was legal. I'm sorry. My bad.
So for conspiracy, not for murder, right? Because murder is a general intent crime, or at least certain types of homicide are general intent crimes. But for certain types of specific intent crimes, and this is common in conspiracy and racketeering charges, because conspiracy law basically wraps up everyone in a conspiracy. Because I did not take any of the chickens out or any of the ducks out of Riker or Sunrise. And the reason we decide we can expand the scope of liability to this huge group of people, right? So in the Sunrise case, the prosecution's theory was every single person who showed up at the demonstration was part of a conspiracy that was a felony. And in theory, could be thrown in prison for 6 years. That was the maximum sentence. And it's because, and the only way you can justify expanding the scope of liability to this huge number of people, including like little kids and grandmas, some of whom just stood on the side of a street with a flower in their hands. That's literally all they did, is if they had the intent to engage in unlawful activity. It's like not fair to hold that little kid holding a flower on the side of the street liable for the person who walked into the farm and took the chicken, unless they reached an unlawful gain.
That is though a little different than what you said about I thought marijuana was legal.
Yeah, I agree.
This is just they agreed to do something factually different than
correct. Yeah,
the scope of their agreement was different.
Yeah. Throw out the comparison about the marijuana party.
Okay. Okay.
The point is, they swept up all these people, including me, in this conspiracy count on the grounds that they believed we had committed this unlawful conspiracy when there was no evidence. Like, in fact, all the evidence that came out on our trial suggested we had a good faith belief that what we were doing is legal. We thought what the factory farm was doing was criminal. And yet the factory farmers, when they admit in multiple text messages and emails, they're even talking about, oh, I don't know if we should be talking about this in email because this is illegal. And they don't get convicted. This is a rule of law issue. It's like you have abundant evidence that these big corporations are breaking the law and they're not held accountable. And you have no evidence that ordinary people are trying to challenge these corporations are engaged in an unlawful conspiracy, and they're thrown in jail for it. And I just think this is true of Democrats and Republicans alike. I don't think there's much of a difference. And it's not just animal rights activists. It's mass incarceration. It's police brutality. It's climate justice. If I guarantee you, when I did focus more on climate change issues, the number of rules and regulations that big fossil fuel companies get away with breaking left and right, that an ordinary person, like if we don't have our registration in order, we get hauled into court and have to pay all these fines. But Exxon and Chevron, all these huge companies can get away with little murder. I mean, they literally poison people and kill them, knowing they're going to poison people and kill them. And instead, even Steven Donziger gets thrown in jail. It's like, what the hell's going on? Steven Donziger was a lawyer who sued, I think it was Chevron, right? I think he sued Chevron and pointed out they'd basically been poisoning people. And was it in Venezuela? I don't even remember what country it was in. Do you remember what country it was?
I don't. I only vaguely heard about that story, I hate to say, but I did
Yeah.
read a little bit about that.
So it's a wild story. And so, I mean, to me, when we talk about the rule of law, like I'm not convinced Democrats or Republicans are actually fighting hard for the rule. At least the party establishment and the people in power, because part of the way they
Yeah.
got into power was just being beholden to these large corporations and influential people who ignore the rule of law when it doesn't suit their interests.
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Not
I mean, I
convinced?
guess, well, definitely not convinced in the context of this presidential election.
Uh-huh.
We're in the home stretch of this. We got, what, 2 months left. I don't believe in third parties.
Mhm.
So I think the choice is Kamala or Trump.
Yeah.
And,
When you say you don't believe,
I
you
just,
mean they're not going to have an impact one way or the other.
I think that we have
They're
a
not going to be
first
elected.
past the post,
Yep.
first past the post political system. And so third parties inevitably are only going to act as spoilers, if anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of, you are kind of throwing your vote away by voting
Yeah.
third party, I think. So I think the choice is essentially one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think the rule of law, if that's, I think you're astutely observing power dynamics that have existed in this country for a long time.
Yeah.
That are a problem. It's, to me, a little bit different than the problem that Trump posed even during his first term,
Mm-hmm.
where he was, doing things like negotiating, leveraging foreign aid to Ukraine on giving him dirt for his political opponent in an election. I mean, you laugh,
I
but
shouldn't
it's just,
laugh because
I
it's
mean,
pretty
think about
awful.
this
You're
election
right.
right
It's
now.
awful what he did.
It is pretty awful.
Yeah.
It's awful. And
It's
also,
also just
think about
embarrassing and
this, like
shameful
what
for our president to be doing these things.
oh,
It's like completely embarrassing
it is.
that we have a president who did
Well,
these
and,
things.
and also think about this. Think about January 6th when they were certifying the vote. What Trump was asking Pence to do, right, at the time was, without any kind of evidence, fail to recognize the certification and throw the whole thing in chaos. He was asking Pence to do that last time. You know who the person is that's in that role this time?
It's going to be Vance. I know.
No. In this election, the person,
Kamala Harris, right?
it's going to be Kamala. Okay. So no one has ever floated the possibility of what happens. And Kamala has a pretty significant stake in doing what Pence didn't do last time, because it would be her who would benefit from if Trump legitimately won the election and she refused to certify. But absolutely no one has even bothered to ask the question.
Yeah.
What would happen if Kamala, because it's just it's a non-starter for her, but for Trump, it's like a relevant question we need to think about.
Yeah.
And I don't want to have to think about that anymore.
Yeah, I think it's deplorable. But the thing is, I just think that Trump is revealing the hypocrisies and the broken nature of the entire system. When he does these things, it's like, yeah, this is kind of the way the system is. So I almost feel like this is terrible.
So what you're saying
but so is the
is
entire
that he campaigns on a platform of the system sucks and the government's broken, and he gets in office and proves it.
So it's more that I like someone who's actually racist to someone who's virtue signaling. I think Trump is just actually racist. He's actually against the rule of law. He's actually a fascist. And he doesn't virtue signal about it. Well, the Democrats virtue signal a lot. And that's concerning to me because it makes people think, oh, we don't have a problem with democracy. We don't have a problem with the rule of law. We don't have a problem with racism. We don't have a problem with animal abuse or climate change, because they do such a good job of virtue signaling that they wave their hand at racial justice. Realize police shootings have actually gone up. They wave their hands at, the fact that we're trying to give people the presumption of innocence, which they're entitled to under the Constitution. Yet we still have more people in prison than we've ever had in American, well, maybe not in American history, but certainly in the last 7 years, we have more people in prison than we've had any time in the last 7 years. And I think part of the reason there's so much grassroots mobilization is because when you don't virtue signal, you can have a real conversation about the way the world is. And it turns out people rally to create change when you have those real conversations. The climate activists in Sunrise, the massive climate protests we saw under Trump, the racial justice protests we saw in 2020, the animal rights protests we saw, the open rescues, the media attention around those open rescues, hitting historic highs in 2018, 2019,
Yeah, I think I do agree that the animal rights movement has gotten a little deflated, but I don't think it's because of Democratic Party is in the White House. I think there's other forces at play, but I
What are
don't
those
really
other
think
forces at play? Just out of curiosity.
I think that there's been, that I've gone on a lot of rants about this, but I do think it has to be talked about, the fact that a significant chunk of the talent and resources and money in the movement is chasing this lab grown meat thing. The rise of Good Food Institute and the effective altruism.
Are you going to call my good friend Bruce Friedrich out, Jeremy?
I think that it's to his credit, he's built a very large, influential organization.
Yeah.
I would not dispute that, but I just think it's turned
Because
out
he's
to be
amazingly
just
effective.
kind of.
Bruce is so effective. He's extremely smart and he's extremely competent.
He is. I agree with that. I do agree with that, actually. I know. I actually genuinely do agree with that.
You just wish you were doing activism instead of cultivated.
Yeah, I just think it's a lot of. And by the way, it's not just Bruce. I know many people who work for that organization are incredibly talented, dedicated people, and to me, that's part of the tragedy, that it's being chased. It's being used to chase a fantasy, and I think that maybe things are starting to change a little bit because. My understanding is that with interest rates going up, easy money in Silicon Valley has dried up.
That's true.
And so there's not as much money for wealthy people to play around with on wild ideas like this. Yeah. So, there's a good thing that Biden's done.
Yeah. Racy interest in killing lab-grown meat.
Well, actually, in all honesty, though, it's not just that. That's one effect, but I do think he's Silicon Valley. My understanding, you're there, so maybe you can speak to this.
Yeah,
they're especially unhappy with Biden. A lot of the Silicon Valley wealthy people are all starting to get behind Trump. The Peter Thiel effect, and that's a group of people that it's one of those things. A lot of people use little heuristics to figure out their politics, and one heuristic that people use is: do the people I find most loathsome, are they for candidate A? And if so, I'm for candidate B. And Silicon Valley investors,
Jeremy.
Exactly. Peter Thiel, all those people, they're really just doing wonderful things for this country, bringing us together. It's really what they're doing. He's bringing us to, I just have noticed ever since he took over X, it's such a harmonious place where everyone gets along, and we're really listening to each other, in between one tweet that's like hardcore porn and then the next tweet is like someone punching someone at school lunch. It's just so odd, the stuff that's, being shoved in your face on that platform now.
Yeah.
But sorry for that aside. But I think that it's, Silicon Valley, the fact that they're getting behind Trump tells me I'm for Kamala.
Yeah.
A little bit.
It's weird. No, I mean, it's
certainly. What do you think? Do you think that the Silicon Valley investors, that whole group, that's a pretty influential segment of society now?
So I'm not as anti.
Do you think that they're good for society?
I don't think they're good for society. I think concentrations of power and wealth, especially extreme concentrations, which you see in Silicon Valley more than anywhere, right? I mean, all the richest people in America are in tech. It's Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. I mean, they're all in tech, like Mark Zuckerberg. And they have massive disproportionate influence, not just on politics, but on culture, because they control X, they control Twitter, they control, I guess X and Twitter are the same thing. They control Instagram and TikTok. I mean, all these huge companies that are shaping public discourse and just, minor tweaks to the algorithm they make, including suppressing certain types of content and enhancing certain types of content, can have dramatic consequences in culture. And none of us even know what's happening. It's extremely scary.
Agreed.
And you're also right that these extremely powerful and dangerous people have been shifting towards Donald Trump. I still think tech is very pro-Democrat. I mean, this is a very liberal place. And I think the difference is last time around, it was just basically Peter Thiel and that was it. Peter Thiel's one of the founders of PayPal. He's good buddies of Elon, but even Elon himself was pretty anti-Trump in 2016 and I think even 2020. Elon used to pal around with Obama. They would hang out at SpaceX launches and talk about green energy transitions and electric cars and a lot of the scandals that Obama was implicated in with like Solyndra that the right was going after him on. It's kind of stuff that Elon supported. It was like he was working with Obama on like green energy transition stuff. So what I'll say in defense of Silicon Valley is, in particular the Silicon Valley VC and entrepreneur classes, I do think they're better than Wall Street, and I think they're better than Big Ag, in that just on cultural issues, for example, they're generally more progressive. They're more open to diverse sets of people being involved in their
See
companies.
now, you sound like you're the virtue signaler. I'm serious. I mean, that's the virtue signal
Woke
stuff rather
capital.
than just looking. That is, I mean, rather
Yeah.
than looking at what their concentrations of wealth
No,
are
that's true.
actually doing to
That's
this
true.
country, you're just saying that this is what's in their heart.
Well, no, it's not just the kind of the diversity policies and kind of their openness to differences. I mean, I think there are, for example, a lot of extremely powerful people in tech who want to take on Big Ag. Vinod Khosla, who's a Democratic supporter, he's actually buddy of Elon. Elon and him have gotten some tussles on X about the fact that Khosla is a Democrat. He's talked about how horrible it is that chicks are macerated. He's funded Hampton Creek / Just and a number of other companies like Beyond. I know you're not a big fan of the plant-based food companies, but there's a reason so many of them are in the Bay Area, because this is a culture and a climate that really does encourage that sort of forward thinking. And you see that in some of the products that are created. It's also a culture that's
For
created.
the record, though, all the best plant-based companies are in the Portland area.
Are they? Like what?
Tofurkey,
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
yeah,
I mean, Tofurkey's
Tofurkey,
great.
Kite
It's like
Hill.
it's OG, but I don't think Tofurkey's actually. I mean,
Oh,
I don't want to
I
talk
love
crap about
Tofurkey.
any of the companies. They're all great. I love them all. But the other thing about Silicon Valley and just this plant-based stuff, I know this isn't the main point you're making. You're making a point about like how do we determine who we should be supporting, who we should be opposing, and what our heuristic is. Like, who do we use to like kind of make a good estimate as to where we should be politically aligning? But uh, the reason I'm not convinced that the plant-based food companies, I disagree with you. I think the cultivated meat and plant-based stuff is good for the movement, just intrinsically, because I think it'll hopefully help people shift towards plant-based foods. And there's some evidence that if people shift towards plant-based foods, even for health reasons or cost reasons, they become more open to animal rights. And I'm not 100% convinced of that, but I think there's a plausible case to be made that if people just eat more Beyond Burgers, they'll be more open to animal rights. But the most important fact is that I think plant-based meats, I mean, they've been growing hugely starting in 2016 all the way through 2020. And in the pandemic, they had a height because all the slaughterhouses shut down and everyone was switching to Beyond and Impossible. But at the same time, all these plant-based meat companies were growing. Like Impossible, I think, had a valuation of like $10 billion, and Google tried to buy them out. And this wasn't in 2020 or 2021. This was like in 2016, 2017. That they had like a $10 billion valuation. So you had all these plant-based meats, cultivated meat companies getting tons of money, and the animal rights movement was growing at the same time. So if anything, like the plant-based meat companies of the last couple of years, I know you're happy about this, have been taking a huge hit at the same time that the animal rights movement is taking a hit. So I think they're kind of, our fates are tied. As the plant-based meat companies grow, the animal rights movement grows. And as the plant-based meat companies come down, our fates to some extent are tied to them. So I'm not convinced that's the reason the animal rights movement has gone down. And I'm not saying the Biden administration is like directly responsible for animal rights activism going down. I think it's more that there's just a sense of ennui. There's like this sense of malaise, especially among young people in this country when the Democrats in office. They just don't get the sense that there's urgency for change in the way that people really felt there was urgency for change under Trump.
I just real quick, a quick note on the plant-based meat growth. I think that a lot of their period of growth has just been because of injections of capital and not so much actually organic
Sales.
increases
Yeah.
in demand. I
Yeah.
think even during those times when Beyond Meat's stock was going
Going
through
up.
the roof, I think that the demand for those products was always pretty low and hasn't gone through a lot of changes. And I think a lot of people who were even looking at their books up close were like, this is not adding up. They're going way, way up. And all kinds of weird things happen with valuations of companies that is not correlating with their organic demand for their product.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the lab grown meat companies, bring in like $100 million investments now, and they don't even have a damn product.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that. So should I feel great that Upside Foods, should I feel like that's a signal that the animal rights movement is gaining more acceptance, that Upside Foods wooed a handful of Silicon Valley billionaires to give them the appearance of being a successful company when they're not actually producing any product at all?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I don't think there's, to me, a lot of evidence that that's actually damaging for our movement, though. And I'm not saying the signals are closely tied. I mean, I think they are tied. I think our fates are intertwined. Partly because if we're successful, the plant-based meat companies will succeed too. If anything, I think the causality runs the other way. It's not that the plant-based meat companies affect us in any way, negative or positive. It's that we can affect them. That if we're extremely
Mm-hmm.
successful. So, for example, when we banned fur in California in 2019, all the
Which was
synthetic,
awesome, by the way.
which was
That's the
awesome.
kind of thing our movement should be doing.
Yeah, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Seriously, I'm
Yeah.
serious. Yeah.
But
What do you
the
think of the
synthetic
ballot initiative
alternatives.
campaigns? What do you think of the ballot initiative campaigns going on right now?
I'm very excited about them. I don't like ballot initiatives in general, just as a method of political activism. And I've told the people at Direct Action Everywhere and the Pro Animal Future people this. But I could be wrong. And I think, and the reason I don't like them is because ballot initiatives are sort of low information, big tent organizing, right? You're basically trying to reach a ton of
Mm-hmm.
people in a very, very limited way because most people not going to pay any attention. You're just trying to reach you're trying to reach them in some small way. You're not trying to transform them. And I think, like, from my reading of social movements, the key is to reach a smaller number of people in a very significant way. Like, quality matters more than quantity. You need like intensity of commitment to create change. And a lot of us have probably even seen this in small organizations. You've worked for big organizations like PETA and PCRM, and you can have a lot of people who care about something in a small way and nothing ever changes. Well, if you can get like a core group of people who are really motivated to do something, it's like you can do a lot.
I
And
think you
so
need both. I think you'd really need both. I think you need
you probably do.
the
Yeah.
committed people in meetings, but I'm telling you, it has always been helpful if you're meeting with your opposition to say, I can pick up the phone and have something go out to 1 million of our supporters, and you're going to be
Mhm.
drowning in emails and phone calls. That still
Well, but
is
yeah, drowning in emails and phone calls is great. I mean, a ballot initiative is not getting people to make emails and phone calls, though. It's just getting them to like tick one box or the
true.
other in an issue they know nothing about. It's like, I don't know. I saw some ad and I guess I'm going to vote yes, or I guess I'm going to vote no. I mean, they're going to think like 15 seconds about it and then forget about it for the rest of their lives. And I just think those sorts of political campaigns, even when you win, they give you like false comfort. I mean, Prop 2 and 12 are examples of this too. I mean, a lot of people, and I'm
Yeah.
not saying they weren't victories. I'm not saying I'm not glad people worked on them. I think they're victories and they're great. But in many ways, I almost think the media attention and the fights about Prop 2 and 12 after they were passed were more important for the animals than the actual effect on animals, because enforcement, for example, is terrible. There's still to be
Yeah.
not a single successful enforcement action of Prop 2 or 12 in the state of California. And there have been changes made to the ag industry for sure. And pig farming has mostly just left the state for a whole host of reasons, including the largest slaughterhouse in the Western United States disappearing. But that has little to do with Prop 2 and 12 directly, because, for example, I mean, the slaughterhouse in Southern California that shut down, it wasn't even affected by Prop 2 and 12 directly. It was, it was a slaughterhouse, not a factory farm. Um, and yeah, but I do think it's exciting these things are happening. And I think what I've told the people running the ballot initiatives, I think the coolest part of the ballot initiatives for me isn't even so much whether they win or lose. And I think they're both going to face uphill battles. There's a ballot initiative in Sonoma County to just outright ban factory farming. And there's a ballot initiative in Denver to just outright ban slaughterhouses. The most exciting thing to me about these campaigns isn't whether they win or lose, but how many people they mobilize and educate and how many people they bring into the movement. And then secondarily, that's like the most important thing. And I think both of them are doing a good job of that. But secondarily, just how much media attention they generate, how many real, deep, substantive cultural conversations. And so, for example, the Sonoma County Ballot Initiative had, I think, for the very first time ever seen, like a deep dive by Political, which is one of the most important political magazines and newspapers in the nation, into factory farming and animal rights. And one of the lines from the article was, you know, radical animal rights policies are possibly going mainstream when you have an entire county that's proposing and may actually ultimately validate in a complete ban on factory farming. And that just shifts the Overton window. It shifts like the sense in the public at large about what's possible. Um,
Yeah, I
but
agree with that.
but yeah, what do you think about the ballot initiatives? I know you guys lost one in Millard County,
Oh,
Utah. So I don't know how you feel about ballot initiatives after that.
that was a heartbreaking loss, especially
Yeah, it was
because the vote
close.
was incredibly
I know it
close.
was so
I think it
close.
was like 230 votes. And I'm a big fan of the ballot initiatives.
Yeah.
And I mean, just in general, trying to get the animal issue more injected into our political process.
Hmm.
I think it's been like maybe the biggest blind spot of the animal rights movement of the last like 20 plus years, is just thinking we can just abstain from that whole world and create change. And I don't think that's possible.
Yeah.
And so, like you said, I think that they're good mobilization efforts. They rally around people around some kind of purpose and goal. I
Hmm.
think that very often people in the animal rights movement feel a little aimless and directionless. What do we do that's productive? They get very bogged down in internal philosophical debates that go on forever. And I think what I like about ballot initiatives and political campaigns is like, here's our goal. We're trying to pass this initiative. It may not be perfect. It's got issues, but it's something.
Yeah.
And it gets people motivated and working towards something. Like you said, even if it loses, maybe it won't next time.
Hmm.
I mean, I often try to think about examples of change I've seen in my own lifetime and think about why they happen. And a huge one has to be gay marriage. I talk about this one a lot, or I think about this one a lot, because I remember the first election I could vote in was Kerry Bush.
Hmm.
And so it was the first election I was really paying attention to everything. And Utah, in that election, had a ballot initiative banning gay marriage, which I think other states had as well. I think that year the Republicans actually put this on the ballot to ban gay marriage in a lot of states to mobilize their side.
Hmm.
And then California passed something similar in 2008.
2008. Yep. It
Yeah,
led to national mobilization against it. I went to a rally in Chicago in 2008 that had probably hundreds of thousands of people. Maybe not hundreds, maybe it was tens of thousands, but it was the biggest political rally I'd ever been to at that point in 2008 was an anti Prop 8 rally, pro gay marriage rally in Chicago. So across the country.
yeah, yeah. And then you had, years later, things. So even if you were on that side, the side rallying
Mhm.
pro gay rights, that probably felt like a huge defeat to you at the time.
Yeah.
And, in 2004 and in 2008 to have to deal with that. But like you said, it was creating a national dialogue. And
Hmm.
those, in the long run, we can look back on that now and realize that that was a necessary short term defeat to a larger goal that, we were eventually going to get to. And I think that, that may be how we have to view these as well, even if they
Yeah.
lose. I think that there's just inevitably going to be a lot of failures before there's a success.
Yeah,
But
Aiden Cook, who's one of the founders of Pro Animal Future, who are pushing the ballot initiative in Denver, he actually gave a talk at the AVA summit about basically how to win by losing. I think that was literally the name of the talk, winning by losing. That you
mhm.
lose, and then it generates enormous amount of controversy and conversations. It allows you to kind of distill the issue and figure out what to do next, right? What were because and that was a huge part of what happened in 2008, at least in California, was part of what happened was when they had all the conversations had to try and defeat Prop 8, because Prop 8 was a ballot initiative that I think it actually even changed the California Constitution to ban gay marriage. I forget if it was just
Utah's did.
legislation.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Utah's did.
yeah, part of what happened in the fight on that ballot initiative in California was enormous amount of learning. And the gay marriage movement,
Yeah.
yeah, they from the product of having all these conversations across the state realized that we have to shift our narrative and our strategic framing away from equal rights and homophobia and this idea of justice towards something that seems more approachable. And I've talked to Dave Fleischer, who's the leader of the political campaigns at the LA Leadership Lab, which is interestingly, the LA LGBT Center is the largest gay rights organization in the nation, from what I understand, even though it's called the LA LGBT Center, because there are just a
Hmm.
lot of gay people in LA. and they're very influential. They're all like, it's weird. I would have thought San Francisco, but I think LA is just bigger. It's a bigger area. There's more people and there's more money. But Dave Fleischer, who was running their political arm back in 2008, he said they did a huge amount of analysis and basically data sifting to figure out, okay, what went wrong? Why were people voting against us? And huge part of it was they were using kind of alienating messaging. They were talking about everyone thought like gay marriage meant, there was going to be someone naked in pink hair streaming down my office, you know, thrusting
Uh-huh.
into my daughter's face. And we needed to focus
That's what I
instead.
thought I was getting. We're not
that's
getting that?
that's what we were. You and I were voting for that. We're like, yeah, let's do
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
No, but and we needed to make it seem more domestic and familial, and so they shifted their framing away from equal rights and towards just protecting love and family, especially family. The idea that, oh, gay people want to have families too, like, because even conservatives like the idea of protecting families, like, oh, we want families to stay intact. And I think the animal rights movement will probably learn some things from these ballot initiatives. When all the folks are knocking on doors in Denver to figure out why people might support a slaughterhouse, when all the people are knocking on doors in Sonoma County to figure out why people might support a factory farm. It's a completely corrupt and unfair process. I actually think both these ballot initiatives would have pretty reasonable shot at winning if it were a fair fight. But the Democratic Party, especially in Sonoma County, less so in Denver, but in Sonoma County, the Democratic Party has been completely broken and corrupt and tried to put their thumb on the scale strongly against the ballot initiative. But even with the unfair fight, I think people will learn a lot from the experience, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens in November. So we'll see. If there's one thing that concerns you most about the election and animal rights, is there any one thing that concerns you the most? It could be an issue. It could be a particular candidate. Maybe it's Trump, because if we have no democracy, maybe we can't enact changes for animals.
Is there one issue?
One issue, person, what's on your mind? I mean, if I ask you the question, as an animal rights activist, what are you most concerned about as November 5th approaches politically?
As an animal rights activist, I don't know. I mean, I think it's just a general kind of breakdown of societal functioning, having Trump back in there empowered to kind of wreak havoc. I think you maybe see a little bit of opportunity in that. I do. And I guess I kind of see that too. It's not that I think that there's a 0% chance that something beautiful could come out of that chaos. But I just, I think for me, when it comes down to how I'm feeling about the election, I remember that the 4 years of living under Trump sucked, and the last 4 years have comparatively been better. And so ultimately, that's kind of how I'm boiling things down, I guess. And
why did they suck and why are they better? Why did the 4 years suck for you from your perspective? And why did the last 4 years or the last 3.5 years feel better?
I mean, it just felt like there was no hope of actually advancing anything positive during Trump's term. All we could hope for was stopping the bleeding constantly. We were just always constantly freaking out about, now he's getting rid of DACA. Now he's getting rid of the Paris Accords. And now they're going to repeal Obamacare. And it was just this constant fire hose of nonsense coming from the administration that everyone was constantly having to react to. And just I also can remember during the early part of the term, he had a high profile conflict with North Korea that scared the hell out of me. Yeah, I don't know that this is a man that truly understands the gravity of things like nuclear war.
This is when he called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And my red button is bigger than yours or whatever.
That's a little scary. It's ridiculous.
It was a little scary.
It's like some sort of ridiculous comedy that's become real life, like Idiocracy or something. I haven't even seen that movie.
And also just the degree to which he's captured the party now is more than it was back then. So, during the first Trump term, you had people like John McCain who stopped the repeal of Obamacare, right, with his big famous thumbs down vote or whatever. And you had Mitt Romney's and Liz Cheney's. Those people are all gone now. And so, if Trump gets elected, I think it's safe to assume he's going to bring Congress with him. It looks to me like Republicans are going to get the Senate no matter what. And so if Trump wins, that probably means they're getting the House as well. So you're going to have a trifecta. And I just think that, I do think you're going to see something like a mass deportation campaign or project. That's scary. I would feel horrible for everyone who gets swept up in that. I'm sure there's going to be good people fighting it tooth and nail legally, using every tool they can. But at the end of the day, Trump will be in charge of the whole machinery of the federal government. That's very powerful.
But to the animal rights lens, why are you worried about Trump?
They're an animal rights lens.
What's the number one?
I just keep coming back to I don't. Animal rights issues obviously have some relationship to federal policy, but it just seems incidental. when animal issues are. So, for example, during Trump's term, one of the first things they did do was they took down the database that the USDA had of inspection
Of
reports
course, yeah.
of laboratories, zoos, everything that's regulated under the Animal Welfare Act. So this was kind of a war on open information, a war on transparency. I definitely think that Trump was not good for things like the Freedom of Information Act. That's a tool that animal rights advocates use all the time. Now, I don't think that they did that because they're like anti-animal rights. They just did it more because they're anti-good governance, frankly. And just truthfully, I mean, and so that ends up affecting animal issues, but I don't necessarily think that sentiment against animal rights was the animating force behind that. It's probably an unsatisfying answer, and I warned you of that when I agreed to this podcast discussion.
No, I don't think it's unsatisfying at all.
that I maybe don't have a super.
I honestly think it's, if you're objective and you're actually looking clear-headedly at the issue, I think it's probably the best argument for an animal rights activist to be against Trump. As an animal rights activist, there are lots of arguments that are independent of animal rights to be against Trump. But
so let me ask you the same question then. Let me throw that to you because you asked the question. I'm guessing you've crystallized how you've thought of this election and what it means for animals. You probably have better thoughts than me. I'll be completely honest.
My biggest concern always is what is going to deflate grassroots movements. What is going to deflate the more transformative?
And see, that's not my biggest concern. I do think that's a difference between us.
Yeah,
because I think of movements. I'm not like addicted to being in a movement. I'd be happy to not have an animal rights movement. If we're just realizing our goals, I'd love to just play guitar and go to the beach all day.
Oh, I would too. Don't get me wrong. I have no, I don't have an intrinsic interest of organizing protests, getting thrown in jail.
Right.
My life has been so exhausting. I just want to hang out with my dog all day. That's like my goal in life.
Exactly. Yeah.
My dog but I think movements are the only way for us to get real and transformative change. I mean, part of it is I think there's more ambitious change that's possible. And I think this is a big difference between me and a lot of animal rights activists. I don't think this is actually a big difference between me and you. I think you think that transformative change is possible too. But I think grassroots movements are the way to get there. And I think so. Whatever is going to enhance a political movement's capacity is what I'm interested in. And I'm actually, even though I've served as a devil's advocate, and I do think grassroots movements were stronger under Trump, I think Trump has also threatened grassroots movements a lot more, right? So he's created opportunities. He also created threats. It's just that, it's better. But I just don't think it's clearly.
It's just, so I think it's true. Let me put it this way. Let's talk about abortion rights. I guess you could make an argument that Trump has been good for the pro-choice movement. But man, it's really come at one hell of a cost policy-wise.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, my point that I'm trying to make is I'm prioritizing the policy side of this first and foremost. And if it means the movement getting deflated because things are not as crazy, I'll take that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can see that. I would just add, as we've discussed through this entire conversation, at the end of the day, policy matters because it changes the world in some way. So we can't just say there's a policy in place so things are fine. We have to say there's a policy in place, and whether it's police brutality, mass incarceration, abortion. Like one of the weird things about Roe versus Wade and Dobbs, for example, is I'm pretty sure abortions have gone up since Dobbs.
They have. I've read that actually.
Weird. And and one of the reasons for that is because most of the places where abortion was banned or abortion clinics were shut down were already places where culturally it was incredibly hostile to people having abortions anyways. And Dobbs has crystallized the issue of anti-choice sentiment across the nation and mobilized a lot of resources behind supporting women and getting abortions in a way that just, it wasn't the case when Roe was in place. And so there's always these weird kind of second order and third order effects that you really have to analyze carefully to determine how policy change is going to affect the real world. I mean, you know this as well as anybody. So, but my biggest concern is just that we can't create good policy that actually does change the world. And we can't ensure that policy that's enacted is actually enforced properly if we don't have a political movement behind it. And so in many ways, my biggest concern is, and maybe I'm feeding into this, is that people paying too much attention to the election. Because I frankly think it doesn't really matter who wins, Harris or Trump, that much for animal rights. What matters is whether we decide we're going to take action. locally,
Yeah,
in our
yeah, I
city
agree.
councils,
I agree with
even
that.
in your local shelter. I think one of the most politically powerful things
Yeah,
you can do is just go to your shelter and adopt a fucking dog. That is a
hell
powerful
yeah. I'm
political
with you
statement in a way
100% on that.
that is so much more powerful than voting for Kamala or Trump 1,000 times, frankly,
Yeah,
especially in a state like Utah or California. Because if either of us had 1,000 votes, I'm not saying you should go vote 1,000 times, but it wouldn't matter even if each of us voted 1,000 times for Trump or Kamala. But it does
right.
matter for that dog's life if you go save that dog, you know? So
Definitely.
I think my biggest fear is that regardless of whether people support Kamala or support Trump or support anyone else, that they think that their hope for change rests in some national political action that doesn't really matter for the animals
Yeah,
compared to what they can
I
do
agree
locally.
with that. I also hope that people think about local political
100%.
levels of change a lot too. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, I think I've talked to you a good bit about. We had a big campaign in Salt Lake that got horse-drawn
Yeah,
carriages
absolutely.
banned from the streets of Salt Lake, and that's honestly like one of I think, by the way, being an animal rights activist in general is one of the most discouraging acts anyone can choose. I mean, for real, and I think we need to be
You're
upfront
not
with that
doing a
with
very
people
good
that it's
job of
been a
selling this, Jeremy.
it's just the truth, but it's you have to wake up to reality and not give people false hope, because then
Yeah.
people burn out more. They
Burn out.
don't think
Right.
they need to know that 9 times out of 10 we're going to
You're going to
lose.
lose. Yeah.
I think that's important for people to know. But the horse-drawn carriages was a rare moment where we won, like, and we just straight up fucking won, and it was
Yeah.
awesome, and it was and I do think
And aren't those victories
before
just so beautiful? They're so beautiful
they
when you
are.
win.
Yeah, they keep you going for a long time too, I think.
Yeah.
But like, before that campaign, I had never really worked that much on like local politics, and so I learned a lot through it. And I honestly learned that actually you really can kind of affect
Yeah.
change,
At the local
like,
level. Yeah.
with not a ton of
Effort.
resources behind you necessarily. If you just got a group of dedicated people
Mm-hmm.
and you think strategically and you target the right people on the city council or whatever the body is, you really can persuade them and reach them. Um, and anyway, I just think that I hope people think about that and what are things I can do on a local level. And because when it comes to the, Kamala versus Trump, like, we are a drop in the ocean of,
Mm-hmm.
affecting that tidal wave, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, you can really be like the key difference that made something happen on a local level that wouldn't have without your effort. I think that's
Yeah.
true.
Maybe this is a good segue into my last question then, which is what gives you the most hope politically for animal rights? Is it this local effort that we're seeing across the country in places like Sonoma County and Denver? What is it that makes you think like, all right, the animal rights movement is down for this and this is great?
I don't know. I fight hopelessness quite a lot, so I don't know if I'm I don't know if I'm the best person to ask that. I mean, definitely. I think to try to get hope, I try to honestly broaden my reference of time
Hmm.
to a larger period.
Yeah.
And I think if you look over, like, let's say a 50-year arc of time, things have gotten better and there's more awareness on that kind of a timeline.
Yeah.
Ringling Brothers shutting down was obviously a huge milestone,
Mm-hmm.
I think, for the movement. We've been working for that for so long.
Yeah.
Every animal rights organization had their hand in that a little bit, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The fur ban in California, I think, really was huge. And that should be modeled elsewhere, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And just definitely there is a little bit more just general awareness
Mm-hmm.
of issues, I think, than there used to be. People know what factory farms are.
Yeah.
I do
If
think,
you're
though, that
looking
we're
at a
starting
50-year time
to,
horizon, it's not a little more awareness. There's massively more awareness over a
yeah,
50-year time horizon.
over a
I mean,
50-year time horizon. But I
even
do,
frankly, in the
yeah,
last 20 years, I've seen a massive change. Like
20
when I
years.
talked
Yeah,
about
that's
factory
fair too.
farms 20 years ago, I don't think the average even student at the University of Chicago knew what the hell I was talking about. They're like, "What? What's a
Yeah.
factory farm? What's wrong with
I
slaughterhouses?"
think
I
my
mean,
my
yeah,
my timeline gets a little more pessimistic at, say, the 10-year mark.
yeah, yeah.
I think the last like 10 years have been a bit of a
Hard.
struggle.
Yeah.
And it's a little harder to point to, and I hate to say it, but some things have gotten worse. I feel like the situation in shelters has gotten worse
Mm.
for sure. The animal overpopulation crisis, things like spaying and neutering have gotten more expensive and harder to do, and it seems like there's less groups working on that.
Yeah.
So it's a very complicated picture. In some areas we're maybe advancing, and in other areas we're not.
Yeah.
Um, not a very satisfying answer, I
That is
know.
the least hopeful statement of hope I've ever heard, Jeremy. You did a
I know. I
terrible
told you
job.
this though. I am not. This is why I could never run for office.
Yeah.
It would be if Barack Obama was hope. It'd be Jeremy Beckham, hopeless.
Jeremy Beckham's face on a poster, hopeless. There you go.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, yeah, I think you're being too unnecessarily pessimistic. I think
Well,
there's
this is why I keep you as a friend,
no, but
so that I can
I just
hear
think
the glasses half full.
I'm less enthusiastic than you are about these ballot initiatives. But the fact that in Denver, I mean, they might just outright ban the slaughter of animals. That's wild. I mean,
Yeah.
the thing that makes me most pessimistic, and it doesn't even make me that pessimistic, is the fact that veganism hasn't grown much. But that was never my theory of change. I never thought that was the way things are going to go. I think it's going to be political and systemic stuff first. And I think I mean, even the fact that Prop 12 won, I just can't imagine like a victory like that. I mean, what Biden did was deplorable, but it was also totally expected by Democratic and presidential
Mhm.
candidates alike because the pork industry. I mean, Iowa is such an important state. North Carolina is a swing state as well.
Why is Iowa an important state, by the way? I know I hear that a lot, but why?
Because of the caucuses. Because it's the first. It's
Yeah, those
one of
really
the
mattered a lot this year.
Yeah, I know. It's perceived as important, whether it is or not. I don't know. I mean, you'd have to be a political
Yeah.
scientist to look at the impact of that caucus on the rest of the presidential campaign. But it's perceived as very important, and it's one of the biggest pork production states in the nation. I think it's a number one. I think Iowa's number one, and then
Yeah.
North Carolina's number two.
As
But
we know, Kamala did great in the Iowa caucuses this year, and so that's why she's the president. And
exactly,
I believe that's why, what was it, Buttigieg
yeah.
was our nominee in 2020, and why Ted Cruz was the
Chris is
nominee in
nominating in 20.
2016.
Yeah, for sure. No, but I think if you had told me a Supreme Court justice, a Republican Supreme Court justice, would write an opinion condemning the corruption of the pork industry in 2023, I would have just
Are you
laughed
talking
at
about
you.
Gorsuch?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I thought
I
his
think
opinion
that
was
was
very good.
more. Well, yeah, you have a bit of a different take than I do on that. I think that was more just because he's critical of an expansionist view of the Commerce Clause.
He is, but he also says in the opinion that if the pork industry really believes it can convince the public in Congress that these gestation crates should be allowed, they should go to the public in Congress. This is an unrun around the democratic process. And it tells you a lot about whether they think they can succeed at convincing Americans that
Hmm.
these gestation crates are tolerable. And that was a pretty powerful statement. I was like, wow, a Republican Supreme Court justice writing an opinion condemning essentially the corruption, the effort by the pork industry to make an end run around democracy
Yeah.
to force pigs into crates. That was wild to me. I was like, when I read that
I
opinion,
mean,
I thought that
well,
was pretty wild.
I think Gorsuch is, Gorsuch also wrote the opinion saying that the Civil Rights Act's protections extend to transgender individuals.
Hmm.
He also wrote the opinion that said basically half of Oklahoma is native territory.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, he's
and
been very
so
strong on indigenous rights.
he's been very strong on indigenous
But
rights.
the
But yeah,
point
he
isn't
also
just
wrote
about Gorsuch.
He also wrote Bostock.
I just don't think there was even space for that sort of opinion to exist in mainstream political circles, even 10 years ago. I think the awareness about the concentration of power, the abuse of the environment, the abuse of workers, the abuse of animals in big ag has gotten to the point where even a Republican Supreme Court justice feels like they can make that sort of statement. Because he didn't have to say that. It was almost just like a little trollish comment about how fucked up big meat is. And he could have just
Yeah.
said, oh, the Commerce Clause doesn't expand to this sort of conduct, so we're not going to strike down the law. Because it could have been just a very legal, objective, neutral analysis. And instead, he just like throws in some shade towards big ag in a way that was really weird and interesting to me. So anyways, that gives me hope.
Yeah.
I think the world's going to change. And I think, there's always lulls and there's ups and starts, there's always kind of points in the movement where it feels a little weaker. And I think maybe it's not because of Biden, but I do think part of it for me is because Biden has created this sense of ennui and this sense of malaise. But I think the election.
I don't have that, honestly. Maybe it's just me personally. I
Yeah.
had way more malaise under, dude,
Trump?
especially 2020. You didn't have malaise in 2020?
Well, 2020 was different. That was because of COVID. I mean, I don't think that was because of Trump.
I
And
think it was a
2020
1-2 punch. That was a 1-2
Yeah.
punch of COVID,
plus
but
Trump.
also, and those two things really together, the fact that we had this national emergency
Yeah.
and we clearly had a moron in charge. I mean, honestly, that was a big part of that added to it. It was like, and there's no one riding this ship.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
I don't know. 2020 was a shit year for me.
Well,
I
let's
mean,
see
I
what
remember
happens.
what now?
I just said, let's see what happens in 2024.
Yeah,
I think
we'll
whatever
see.
happens, as long as people realize that they do have power to create change, even just in one animal's life. I mean, that's going to be crucial. So let's just keep beating that drum. All right, my
Yeah.
friend. Thank you very much. We've been going almost
All
2
right.
hours. You got to get to class, and I got to get to a meeting.
Okay.
It was a good time.
All
I
right.
enjoyed it.
Sounds good. I can't imagine who would want to listen to us ramble on for a couple hours, but it's been fun.
You'll find out. You'll find out.
Okay.
And
All
leave
right.
it in the comments, the podcast and the channel on YouTube. Okay. All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye. We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.